Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. It's only been a few hours today, and I've already learned a lot and seen a lot of controversy. And we're going to talk a bit about innovation by country, innovation by company. And I just want to give a couple of snapshots of things that have already been said before I turn over some questions to our distinguished panel, a panel of top technologists and management from key companies, Microsoft, AMD, EMC. I've heard that the U.S. has lost its way. We need to find our own new role. I've heard that cell phones are going to get more and more capable, and we're within 5 years of some pretty dramatic improvements. Things like ultra-wideband, whether that's 5 years or not, but they're on their way, location-sensitive, electronic wallet, location-based cell phones. I've heard with Japan and China relationship, the Japanese are really very interested in working with China, maybe more than the U.S., but they're happy that the U.S. Navy is somewhere out in the water in case things go the wrong way. And supercomputers and super visualization. Heard about telepresence and 10 gig connectivity. Broadband either is here or isn't here, depending on the bandwidth you rely on. And as a lifelong resident of the state of Virginia and present resident of the state of Virginia, I was thrilled to hear that Governor Warner has reversed his long-standing opposition to support of higher education. My 5 sons and I are thrilled to hear that. And hopefully with the words he has now, we can get the funding for the state to the University of Virginia above the all-time low 8% it stands at today. So anyway, with that political commercial aside, and I voted for Governor Warner, so I think he's a great guy, and I'm glad to hear he's going to push this for my kids. We have with us Jonathan Murray, the Worldwide Technology Officer for the public sector at Microsoft. Jonathan, before this, ran global accounts at Microsoft, a strong customer base, worked at Arco as a technology strategist, an amateur photographer and astronomer. Hopefully we can look through the telescope of Jonathan's thoughts and see the future. Phil Hester, the CTO of AMD, chair of the AMD Technology Council, co-founder prior to that and CEO of Nuisys, and a 23-year-long IBM career prior, including key development of the RS-6000. Jeff Nick, SVP and CTO of EMC, leads the EMC Office of Technology, involved in the information lifecycle management. Also a long career with IBM, 24 years, and an IBM fellow. So I think we have the right people on the panel. Let me start with the questions. Innovation goes up and down through the past 25 years. Sometimes it's roaring and sometimes it's not. I hear a lot of people complaining there isn't much innovation going on right now. Let's talk information technology rather than biotechnology and things like that. In information technology, Jeff, where are we? Is it just one of those flat periods, or has innovation really slowed, or is it going? What's the story?
No, I don't think it's slowed at all, Don. I think innovation is accelerating at an exponential rate. I think I don't see any downturn in that trend. I think what is maybe noticeably different is where is innovation occurring. I don't think I'll point at a couple things, maybe just stimulate some thoughts from the other panel members, but one thing I'd say is that I see more innovation coming from increasingly outside the United States, which is not to say there isn't innovation in the U.S., but that we are seeing proportionately more occurring, and I certainly anticipate that to increase. And then the second thing is maybe a topic for a longer discussion is innovation inside a company versus outside companies in terms of startups or through VCs and things of that ilk. I find that there's some very interesting tensions between being a public company and being able to innovate, and the cost models associated with that actually drive innovation outside of the established traditional companies in terms of spin-outs and then spin-ins or acquisitions of technology, as opposed to as much traditional in-house design and development. And I'd like to hear from Jonathan and Phil if they're observing the same things. But I don't think it's that we're falling flat on innovation. I think It's taking different forms and coming from different places.
So innovation's moving ahead. It's just more a global matter now, and it's not always the big companies, internal to the big companies that are doing the innovation.
Yeah.
That's kind of it. Jeff?
Phil.
Phil, I'm sorry. I just said Jeff.
Yeah.
I just talked.
I guess I agree exactly with what you said. The other part I'd add is I think that a lot of the innovation that goes on that is potentially in the U.S. is actually for consumption outside of the U.S. Let me give you some examples. One of the things that we've been wrestling with was the comment that was made earlier about, cell phones continue to get more powerful. What's the gap, if you will, between a cell phone, a PDA, and a notebook? And in some of the countries, that's probably going to be the appliance that an individual carries as opposed to a traditional notebook like just about everybody that I see in this audience has in front of them. And as you look at these other devices, one of the questions has to do with the business model around it, and how you make these devices more affordable. I think in developed countries, we think a lot about purchase price. That's kind of our definition of affordability. And in a lot of countries, the week-to-week income varies tremendously. You may have money one week disposable to put on an information appliance, the next week you may not. And so you've seen kind of, if you will, cell phone cards that you could buy for a certain number of minutes become very popular, and that was what revolutionized the cell phone acceptance in some countries. I think there's an opportunity to innovate in technologies like that to enable these information appliances. So actual hardware innovation that goes in, if you will, that is enabling a new business model in a country outside of potentially where that technology was created. And so I think you'll see things like that. I agree that the innovation from my perspective is continuing to accelerate. There's certainly a lot more patents filed outside the U.S. relative to the ratio inside than there has been in the past, but the aggregate number continues to grow. And there's also this interaction that happens between all the inventions. There's a great series on BBC probably 10 years ago called Connections with James Burke.
Yep.
And the subtitle of that was The Unintended Consequences of Invention. And basically what it linked was totally independent inventions that happened in different places at different times, interacting in a way that no one that was involved in the inventions ever had in mind. And I see a lot of that stuff happening. Ultra wideband is, I think, an example of that. There's stuff around Bluetooth that's happening that I would put in that category too.
But a quick follow-on, Phil. Sorry. I'll make sure I get everyone's names right, including my own. There's a tremendous amount of technology innovation in the handset, but who cares? The UI is too small, the keyboard's too small, the screen's too small. You could turn it into a supercomputer, but if I can't get the user tied into it, does it matter?
We haven't told our kids what you just said.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, because I don't know how you are. I have a 13-year-old kid who IMs the whole time on a cell phone.
Yeah, okay.
So with my eyes and yours, I agree the screen is probably a little bit small. But my point is it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all. You're going to have different classes of devices. We can probably talk some of the things that are going on with Microsoft, looking at this new class of device, whether you want to call it a brilliant phone or an ultra-light small notebook. But there's going to be a range of devices. My point is that as you try to get more and more access to the information technology, there are some technological limits to the cost structure of those devices. A bigger screen is more expensive. That's how it's going to be.
Weighs more.
Right. It's got worse battery life. It's less portable. So I think there's a lot of people out there that, in fact, are happy, maybe not happy, but at least can use a small screen, small keyboard. As the cost of the technology comes down in this one laptop per child initiative that we've been involved in, of trying to get a usable laptop down to a $100 price point, is fairly attractive. I mean, the technology will be there in the next couple of years to do that kind of stuff. Is it a full function notebook that runs a full software stack? No. Is it good enough for a lot of people? Probably so.
Okay, Jonathan, what do you think?
I'd pick up on what Phil said about the combinatorial effect of technologies in the innovation cycle. And there's perhaps another way to think about it, which is sort of the way I think about it, which is visible innovation and invisible innovation. And I agree with Jeff, in our view, there's no diminution in the amount of innovation that's going on. But a lot of the innovation, you go in cycles, a lot of the innovation today is happening in the platform. So it's essentially innovating within the infrastructure, which is laying the groundwork for the next wave of innovation that's visible to everybody.
You're saying the network is the computer?
And I'm not saying the network.
Okay, just checking.
The software, the systems, and the networks, but this is Phil's point, but it's the combinatorial factor of all of that innovation. It's the innovation in the phones, the devices, the networks, the services, the software stacks that run those services. And what I would sort of look at, if I look at our innovation cycle at the moment, we're sort of on the major innovation within the platform. But ultimately, what you're doing is laying the groundwork that says, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, a whole bunch of other people can innovate on that platform and will bring visible innovation that brings utility to end users and puts it into the hands of millions and millions of people around the world. So there's a slightly different way to think about the innovation cycles, whether it's visible or invisible, to what we would call the end user.
So innovation's on a roll. This is what I'm hearing from the distinguished panel here. Let's talk about countries for a second. I heard earlier today the United States is graduating 75,000 engineers a year, while India is graduating 400,000 engineers. Don't know if you should have to have an engineering degree to use technology, but it's still a lot more engineers coming from India than the United States. Very big successes in Korea, Finland, Ireland, companies that have proven they can take technology and innovation and use it to improve their GDP. What's the roundup globally? Who's succeeding and who's failing? Why has it happened, and where does the United States stand in this? Jeff?
Well, let's see. I think that, well, certainly the obvious players are India and China. I mean, the sheer numbers are overwhelming, and I do not share the security blanket view that suggests that there's some entitlement in the United States to be forever the leaders on an innovation cycle. We are proud of our heritage. The United States has been the bellwether for innovation in technology, but as Thomas Friedman said, the world is flat. We collectively are building out the very technologies that lower dramatically the barriers to entry. And I would also say that there's a significant difference with respect to the hunger for participating in the sciences and technology fields that I see in countries like China, the Asian continent in general, and certainly India, around the motivations to get into the technological fields. And if you look at the United States by comparison, we continue to see a decline in our kids who actually want to go into these fields. So if you look at the sheer numbers on the one hand, the enablement factor that levels the playing field, and the interest and passion and attraction into those fields, it doesn't leave one with a very comfortable feeling with respect to the future of technology as a leadership position for the United States, unless we start to really make some changes.
So I hear kind of a cultural aspect to things. You
Absolutely.
like India, you like China. Phil, the same question, but with a little bit of a twist. It seems to me, just my personal opinion, that the government in Korea in particular is very focused on guaranteeing that the infrastructure will be there. And if the government needs to build the infrastructure, they'll build the infrastructure. But everybody's going to be wired. They don't leave it up to free enterprise or open competition as much as some other countries. There's certainly open competition in Korea. So kind of the same question, who's winning, who's losing, where's the U.S., and what's the role of government? Should government be more active than they are in the U.S. or less active?
Probably every government that you ask that question of will give you a different answer. So I'll give you a kind of a consensus view, I think, that there's various ways to be successful. I mean, certainly there are countries around where the government has been the center point for driving the technology. There are other places that are successful where the government has encouraged private business to also be successful, has built investment climate, a tax situation that encourages that kind of behavior for technology development. It largely has to do, I think, to a certain extent, too, with the culture of the countries. The comment that Jeff made earlier, I absolutely agree with, that for historical reasons, we had a monopoly for a period of time, if you will, almost not complete monopoly, but if you will, a virtual monopoly on technology development. Those days are gone. There's no monopoly here in the U.S. on intellectual capital that exists around the world with the information technologies that we now have in place. Global development to us is a fact of life. The other thing that I think we've learned is that if you're not doing technology development in the country where that technology will be consumed, you're not going to really fully understand the best way to develop that technology. It's a lot better from our perspective to do distributed global development, and in particular have development organizations in the countries to be able to deal with the specific needs of that country, because it is quite a bit different in terms of the buying criteria of an individual in India versus China versus Brazil versus some of the Nordic countries.
Okay, so no monopoly in the U.S. Again, back to the idea of globalization. There's, if you're going to do technological development, if you're going to do innovation, you have to understand the local market. You can't do it from some perch far away. Jonathan,
Our expression is high income, highly educated, older white guys in the U.S. are probably not the folks you want doing development for emerging countries.
Can I
they're
pick up?
the wrong guys. Okay, I
pick up
understand.
on what-
Jonathan, please.
I agree with Phil in terms of doing development increasingly closer, at least having your research be increasingly closer to the markets you're trying to serve. So understanding emerging markets, which is the big new opportunity for a lot of technology companies, you've got to be close to those countries, those cultures. Very different. But in some respects, I disagree a little bit with Phil, which is that's Phil talking from an American global company's perspective, which is AMD doing research, right? So you have the whole infrastructure of AMD, or you have the whole infrastructure of Microsoft behind that model. That's very different from saying which countries are effective at building entrepreneurial startup innovation processes. And far be it from me to be the person that defends the United States. I lived here for 12 years, but I live in Switzerland today. But the US really does. You have to take a systems view of this. And the US does some pretty strong advantages when you take the total systems view of the innovation cycle, which is the generation of IP, the ability to exploit that IP in entrepreneurial businesses, the ability to have risk capital be available, the ability to support people who fail. So the bankruptcy laws, I know which have changed in the US just recently. But the whole cycle of things which allows people to try things, fail, repeat until success is a fairly unique model that the US has got. I spent a lot of time with the European Commission in Europe, and the European Commission would love to replicate the number of, I was at a conference last week in Brussels, and the number of times the US was held up as an example of what Europe wants to do and wants to succeed at. This is all about innovation, was almost embarrassing, right? But they cannot find a way to replicate that unique set of circumstances in the US. Now, that's very different from saying there's a set of pool of talent out there that you want to go and tap into. But the innovation process, the systems view of innovation, I think the US has a fairly unique model. And I find it in very few countries around the world where you have that ability to replicate that.
So we're crying in our beer a little too much around here.
I'm not sure about that, but I'm just saying you have to separate two things. Global companies using talent from around the world to drive further innovation in their platforms and find other startups that they can incorporate into their business models, that's one thing. But talking about our countries truly driving grassroots innovation in an entrepreneurial process, I think that's very different.
Well, let's talk about global companies for a minute. And there was a recent article, April the 17th in Business Week, cover article, quantitatively measured the increase over the last 5 years in the S&P 500 net income as a percent, the increase in their share price as a percent. Something like 143% increase in net income, 0.9% increase in share price over that 5-year period. Now, there are a lot of different companies, but they're large, very predominantly US-based companies. What's going on here? Why isn't the market rewarding the profitability? Is it a perceived lack of innovation? Jonathan, I'll start with you.
This is not an area of expertise that I'm particularly comfortable with. I don't think it's a perceived lack of innovation. I think it's in certain circumstances a perceived lack of growth potential, right? I think that's incumbent on companies such as mine to be able to illustrate to the street where that growth potential is and to do a better job of that. And believe me, there's enough growth out there. There's enough opportunity out there, and putting the systems and processes in place to be able to exploit that. I think, from my view, that's one of the challenges we have.
Phil?
I guess I'd agree with the comments just made here about the scale of some of these companies makes it hard for them to prove that there is a growth opportunity. I mean, going from a $10 billion to $50 billion company is a heck of a lot harder problem than going from 10 million to 50 million. And so I think some of the challenges that these large companies face is that the majority of the area they can effectively serve, they're already in. What do they do next, right? And then that's a hard thing for them to do. The antibodies start coming out when they go into, if you will, new areas that are potentially a threat to the core businesses. I think that's where the innovation can happen. And for the large companies, one of the challenges, I think, is creating an environment where the innovation can happen. And to Jonathan's point, you show the street on a continuing basis, you've got the ability to do that. And if you can't, you're not going to get rewarded.
Jeff, what do you think?
Well, I have a saying which is a corollary to Janis Joplin's line from me and Bobby McGee, which is freedom is just another word for no legacy to lose. And by that, what I mean is that the more successful a company gets, as Phil was saying, the more expectancy there is that that company will continue to be successful. And we get hooked on the revenue and the profit that's being generated by a company. And if you look at the equation of risk-reward trade-offs, right, from an investor's perspective, do you want to take risk with that where you've got your children's education fund, or do you want to take risk by seeding some things that are smaller, less to lose, and potentially have more huge payoffs? So I've never actually tested this, but it's my view that the more successful companies in the United States in their life cycle are actually getting punished in their stock price for not having a growth strategy, and yet they're not rewarded for actually turning their assets to focus on the very innovation that would stimulate growth. It's an interesting catch-22.
So it's the investors.
I think there's a lot to do with the investors.
There's a lot to do with the investors, kind of short-term in it.
Yeah.
That's sort of like blaming your customers. It's incumbent on us to do a better explanation to our investors.
All right, I agree with that.
Can I come back? There's an anecdote I wanted to go back to this, your question about where innovation's happening and isn't happening on a global basis. Because I know, with AMD, we share a sort of fairly strong conviction about emerging markets and where, technology gets the next billion consumers from. I was in Qatar just a couple of weeks ago for a panel on science and innovation and technology and education. And obviously, it's a small country in sort of the Gulf that's really focused on how do we apply the resources we have today to build knowledge-based society that enables innovation to move forward. And Carnegie Mellon's opened a campus, a distributed campus there in Doha. And they've inducted their first class of computer science graduates sort of 2 years ago. I got the opportunity to do lunch with them, to give them a talk about innovation and the software industry. And they've got a robotics class. And they're basically teaching graduates who've been inducted into computer science how to do robotics. And one of the most illustrative comments I heard was from the professor that runs that class. And she said, on the first day when we inducted the students into the class that came in the first time, we gave them these robot kids. And this is mixed classes sort of in the Middle East, so it's women and men. So they opened the boxes. Some people started crying in the class because they'd never actually built anything in their life. The society never encourage them as kids to basically put things together and to play around with things. And so they were overwhelmed by emptying a box of components onto the floor and then being asked to do something with it. And sort of got me thinking about whether one of the indexes of sort of potential innovation might be what I call the Lego index, right? Which is, if you looked at sales of Lego per head of population in countries around the world, would there be some, I'd like to see the data on this actually, would there be some correlation between some measure of innovation within that country and whether we actually teach kids to play and innovate and to play around with things when they're growing up? And I think you'd find there is a strong correlation. And that's one of the things, there's a magazine here called Make, right? It's the only country in the world I know has a magazine about how to hack things, right? That's another advantage that the U.S. has.
So Zoo Tycoon is kind of the virtual side of that?
Absolutely, but physical things I think are absolutely important.
Well, watching my son on his Xbox 360 play Ghost Recon Advanced Warfighter, or GRAW, with a bunch of guys in England against a few people from Spain, I'm convinced that whether we innovate or not, Great Falls, Virginia is safe from attack. Continuing the question, let me change this a little bit about what are the key technologies that you guys see, say, from now for 5 years? Let's put a five-year window on it. Information technology or IT related. What's going to change the world? What are the couple of things? And if applicable, what are your companies doing in the space? What's going on to the extent you can discuss it publicly. Jeff?
Well, this is a fascinating question, and I'd be hard pressed to pick just a couple that I think are going to stand head and shoulders above all the rest. But I will make, I guess, two things come to mind, not necessarily because I think these are the most selling, but a couple of trends. One is, I want to pick up on something that Jonathan said on the first question around innovation in the infrastructures themselves being an enabler of the future. I absolutely agree with that, and we at EMC are spending a great deal of time and effort in that area, seeing some fundamental shifts occurring. For example, in terms of enabling access to IT capabilities that have been traditionally locked inside enterprises, now moving outside the enterprise walls. And the way that that happens is through the ubiquitous connectivity, the tremendous bandwidth, and service-oriented architecture approaches that allow services to be delivered and to be loosely coupled together and create compositions that allow, in our case, information services delivered to the home that are not just about content delivery, but actually all about the traditional IT kinds of things around security and backup and archive and content analysis and collaboration. So one of the dimensions I would put forth is the leverage of IT infrastructure technologies outside the firewalls, really allowing it to come to us in whatever form we want to consume it, whether it's services on our BlackBerries and our Palm devices, et cetera, or through laptops or into our home. The second one is, just to give two, a different example. I see a tremendous amount of innovation starting to occur, and I'm still waiting for it a bit, around global human interaction and collaboration. I think we've made great strides in terms of access to information. I think through the internet, the next step and the next wave that needs to occur is eliminating the local remote transparency issue for humans to actually interact. I mean, there's still a big disparity between people sitting in a conference room and being dialed in, and then those that are dialed in remotely. And so we still fill the sky with planes. I think technology has a lot to do with this. We have the technologies, but now we need to move to the human interaction patterns that kind of eliminate that disparity so that people in different companies really can interact real time, really collaborate on information processing. And I see some glimmers and some interesting technologies coming on the horizon, but this is an area where I think we'll see some very significant strides.
Phil, people used to say, build it and they will come. Right. What I'm hearing now is make it usable and they will buy.
Exactly.
Is that your perspective as well?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges with the technology for a lot of people is the amount of complexity they have to deal with. I think one of the areas that's coming, hopefully, is enough computing power to put layers of software on it that can, in fact, make it easier to use. I know more software and easier to use is kind of a conflict with some people, but I think the capability of these devices to be much more natural, to Jeff's point here about being able to naturally collaborate across distances. I mean, there's two pieces of that to me. One is the communication bandwidth, which is coming, and the other is the interaction between the device and the person that's sitting there in person. So there's a lot of innovation, I think, in that area. We've been experimenting with what I call an HD quality video conferencing facility. It's point-to-point at this point, but it works. It gives you a sense of being there. I think, again, from our perspective, global development, that will help. The other major area of innovation I see is around power efficiency, of continuing to focus not just on the traditional power efficiency in a data center or a desktop product, but in the ultra-mobile space. One of the big challenges there is you want this device to be small enough, light enough, you can put it in your coat pocket, it'll last a minimum of a full day, hopefully a full 2 days if you're not to the point you can charge it. So a lot of innovation there.
Last word, Jonathan.
It's not Web 2.0.
It's not Web 2.0. Okay, well, the last word there from
let me just
representative from
clarify,
Microsoft.
If you give me 30 seconds to clarify. It's not Web 2.0 because the other points have been made, which is huge computational capability on the end device. It's going to transform the way we think about using computing. Makes it disappear into the environment, wearable, all the sorts of things we've talked about. That computational capability is now coming. Web 2.0 still requires systems programmers and developers to glue together components in the service infrastructure. The next big transition is when those service components can glue themselves together.
Okay.
And when you get autonomous service configuration and ad hoc service configuration, then we're going to see a wave of innovation like we've never seen before.
Excellent. On that positive note, gentlemen, I'll thank you very much.
Thank you.
I know you'll be around a little bit later, so for any questions, thank you.